I'll kick it off happily. So, hello everybody. My name is Anna Campoverde. I am the director of the Latino Institute here at Seton Hall University. We provide scholarships, we do cultural programming and professional development for students across campus. This event is part of the university's Hispanic Heritage Month celebration, which you can learn more about by scanning the QR code in the next slide over. So we have a month-long celebration filled with the Institute's or filled with events and content projects across campus. So please make sure you check that out. So during this event, we're encouraging everyone to use the chat feature. And then during the Q&A, please use the raise hand feature. Tonight, we welcome you to Election 2020, the impact of the Latino vote, to explore the question, how deeply can the Latino population of the United States affect the 2020 presidential election? So with the election only 5 weeks away, we've gathered Seton Hall academic scholars and Seton Hall alumni to explore voting trends, voting patterns, and current event cycles. Our moderator for tonight, happy to introduce, is Dr. Matthew Hale. He is an associate professor and director of the MPA program. So Dr. Hale, please take it away.
Thanks a lot, Anna. I appreciate it. I'm Matt Hale. I direct the MPA program at Seton Hall, and on behalf of all the panelists, I just wanted to say thanks to Anna and the Unanue Center. This is a great event. And we're looking forward to it. Before we get to the guests, one of the things that I'm going to try and do is put the Latino vote in some context of the election, the larger election. And our goal is to look at the impact of the Latino vote, but we can't really do that without looking at some context of the 2020 election itself. And I think at the end of the day, to be blunt and to be simple, this is simply the most important election of our lifetimes. It's that important. And I say that as a political person, but I also say it with the backing of some other folks. There's a Rutgers professor named Gerald Pomper who has written historical books about every presidential campaign since about 1972. And he said the other day that this is nothing less than a referendum on the continuation of the American experiment in democracy. That's a pretty high bar to reach. And one of the things that I think he argues, and one of the things that I think we ought to consider is that when you think about previous elections, the way that a lot of people frame those elections are that if candidate A wins, my taxes go up, or candidate B wins, they go down. Candidate A is more likely to provide me with health care. Candidate B is more likely to not provide me with health care. And so a lot of the ways that people frame presidential elections are those individual aspects. What does this mean for me, or how am I going to do better or do worse based on what happens in this election? And those are certainly true. But when you look at what people often are talking about, when you hear and you listen in the media, as I often do, to supporters of both sides, we're hearing another narrative. If you talk to many Trump supporters, a Biden victory is nothing more than the creation of socialism. They're convinced that with Biden, there will be socialism in America. And if in turn you ask a lot of Biden supporters, what happens with the Trump victory, and you'll hear the word fascism is what will happen. And so the intensity of not just having this belief that it's about individual thoughts or individual outcomes, but that a victory by one person or the other is going to lead to a fundamental change in how we structure governance, a fundamental change in how we actually organize ourselves as a country and how we choose to govern ourselves. That's a big deal, right? And so the more that's the stakes, or that's the way that this election is often being framed by supporters. And the crazy part is that we're doing this in the midst of a worldwide pandemic, right? It's one that is forcing us to use unprecedented ways of voting, ways of often untested vote by mail systems, on an unprecedented scale. It seems to me that in some respects we are quite literally trying to build a new airplane while we're flying it. And that's really the context that I see the 2020 election happening. And within that, we have how does the Latino vote have an opportunity to influence and affect what goes on? And our panelists are going to dive deep into that today. But I thought it was important to sort of put onto that overall context. And so with that, I wanted to introduce our panelists. I'll introduce everybody, and then what we'll do is we're going to go back. We'll talk to each one of them a little bit in turn. We've got some questions for them, and then we'll open it up to those folks listening for their questions. So to begin, I want to introduce Dr. Patrick Fisher, who's a professor in our department. He is in addition to being a very cool guy, he is a quite prolific in his scholarship, and his books are Insufficient Representation: The Disconnect Between Congress and Its Citizens, and then one that I think is particularly interesting, and I encourage everyone to go find it: Economic Conditions and the Presidential Vote for Obama: The Underappreciated Influence of Race. I think it's a fascinating read, and I would encourage everybody to take a look at that. Our next panelist is Maria del Kid Koso. Did I say that correct, Maria? I think Maria might be frozen, so I'm going to hope that I did. Maria is the director of the Office of Policy and Legislative Affairs for the New Jersey Department of Health. She's a Seton Hall graduate with a master's degree from Rutgers. We sort of let that one get away. Sorry about that, Maria. Maria serves as the liaison between the Department of Health, the Governor's Office, and legislative offices on all health-related issues, including COVID-19. Maria, prior to this, served as Chief of Staff to Assemblyman Jerry Green. So I'm hoping that Maria is going to be unfrozen soon. She looks a little frozen right now. Maybe she's not, but we'll get back to her. Our last panelist, and I'm not sure if he's here yet, is Jonathan Castaneda, who's a municipal administrator in the town of West New York. Jonathan is both an undergraduate of the diplomacy school, but also a graduate of the MPA program, and is the borough administrator for West New York. He's also been very, very active in politics at the local level. And so we have national, we have state, and we have local level that I think is important. So, okay, so Patrick, we're gonna kick it off, and I went back and in 2008 I wrote an article about media coverage of the 2004 election in Spanish and English, and one of the arguments that we made back then is that for many years pundits and scholars alike have predicted the rise of Latino political power, a trend partially explained by recent demographic changes. And then I go on to list those changes, and in November of 2000, Latinos were about 5.5% of the vote. In 2004, it was 6%. In the midterms in 2006, it was 8.6%. In 2010, it was about 10%. In 2016, it was about 11% of the vote. So the number of Latinos that are voting in presidential elections is growing significantly and dramatically. But there's still, even though we are 10 years from when I wrote this article, have this sense that Latinos are punching below their weight, that there is not the impact that they could have on the presidential election in particular, as much as their numbers might cause us to believe. I remember talking about waking the sleeping giant as this idea that this was something that was going to happen sooner or later. So I wonder if you might just start off and talk to us a little bit about how you see and understand why and how Latino participation is where it is, and how you might see it coming up in the 2020 election.
A lot has happened since 2004, no doubt. And I think it has it is safe to say that so far Latinos, at least in terms of national politics, have punched below their weight in terms of just their percentages in the population. And the conventional wisdom going back to 2004 was that if you're going to, either of the parties, if they're going to win long term, they needed to hold their own among the Latino vote. And especially with Obama's victories, where Obama did very well among Latinos, there was a lot of worrying in Republican circles that Republicans were losing ground among Latinos, and that they needed to readjust their policies in a way that was more appealing to Latinos. Well, then along comes Donald Trump, okay? And that strategy kind of went completely out the window, because in 2016, he was overtly adopting a strategy of white racial resentment that was not designed to appeal to American Latinos. And as president, he's kind of doubled down on his message, I think. He has practiced what he preached in 2016. What I find interesting looking ahead to this election is that looking at polling data so far, it looks like Trump is actually doing better among Latinos than he did in 2016. And this is not what I would have thought just based on his governing behavior over the last 4 years. But in terms of the getting back to your question, in terms of the participation and the impact Latinos will have in 2020, for the presidential election, it all comes down to the Electoral College. And I think this is an underappreciated aspect of the Latino vote. And I must admit, I'm part of the problem here. I wrote a book, Demographic Gaps on American Political Behavior, and I focus on the Latino votes as kind of a monolithic entity like African Americans. Just it's easier to portray. That's our data. But there are huge differences among the Latino community in terms of their voting preferences. And this really plays out at the state level. And by playing out at the state level, this plays out in the Electoral College. Before the presentation started, you mentioned a professor that said was it a professor? Somebody that it was all going to come down to Florida. Okay, the Latino vote in Florida. Okay, right. So this to me is, I think that's hyperbole. I don't think it'll all come down to the Latino vote in Florida. But if you are a Trump supporter, he's behind in the polls right now, you'll take it coming down to the Latino vote in Florida, because it looks like Trump is doing much better among Latinos in Florida than he did in 2016, and than he's doing elsewhere in the country. Okay, Florida is kind of a fascinating state in this regard, because, and one thing about polling, when you have relatively small sample size, it might not pan out to be like this come election day. But in polling of Florida that's been done so far, Florida is always competitive, but it looks like the demographics of support of the among the parties has changed. Trump is doing very well among Latinos, largely because he's doing well among Cuban Americans in Florida, while Biden is doing much better than your typical Democrat among older Americans. So older Floridians, I should say, specifically in Florida. So the vote total in Florida, it looks like it could be very close again, but the coalitions of support could be quite a bit different. Looking at another state where I think the Latino vote, and unquestionably the Latino vote is going to be critical in Florida, no doubt about it. Patrick, but another state in the Electoral College that I think is very important. Yeah.
Before you move on to I wonder if you have any thoughts on the folks from Puerto Rico who have moved to Florida. I read an article the other day that about 400,000 Puerto Ricans have since the hurricane have moved to Florida, set up shop, set up home, and will be voting. That's a pretty big influx of a new demographic group in Florida.
Right, and one that you might expect to vote a lot different than Cuban Americans. Puerto Rican, Puerto Rican Americans, but Puerto Ricans, of course, are Americans. So Puerto Ricans that move off the island have a stereotype of being Democratic, and in the Northeast, they're overwhelmingly Democratic. New Jersey, New York, Chicago, places where there's large Puerto Rican population. They have tended to be almost as democratic as African Americans, overwhelmingly so. For whatever reason, so far, that has not played out in Florida, which I think is kind of interesting. There was talk that this could be a critical group in the 2018 midterm elections, and especially in kind of swing areas within Florida itself along what is it, the I-95, the freeway that takes you from Orlando to Tampa Bay, kind of central Florida. And it turns out that Puerto Ricans who end up moving to Florida and voting have not been nearly as democratic as they have been elsewhere in the country. So that isn't necessarily a change that would help the Democrats as much as you might expect it to. At least that's the early indications. One also thing with Florida, the diverse Hispanic population there, there's a lot of Colombian Americans, Venezuela Americans, Central America. The biggest Latino group by far in the United States, of course, Mexican Americans, but that's a relatively small percentage of Latinos in Florida. And I think that says a lot about why Latinos in Florida are quite a bit different, okay? In places where Mexican Americans are the dominant Latino group, and I was gonna go, this leads me to Arizona, where I was kind of going before. And say specifically the Mexican American vote in Arizona is going to be pretty critical. And this is, I think, kind of a good example of a state where if Latinos are going to finally start punching their weight, okay, Arizona represents kind of a model for that. And if Biden ends up winning Arizona, and he's been ahead in the polls slightly, pretty consistently, it would come down to a very good showing among Mexican Americans, and would indicate like the power of the Latino vote and the change of the Latino vote. And just to wrap up, thinking of your study that you did in 2004, and to show you just how this has changed quite a bit over the last 16 years. 2004, Bush won a very close re-election campaign. And part of the reason that at least sold for him winning re-election was that he did very well for a Republican among Latinos. And that was seen to be kind of a critical. He wasn't winning the Latino, other than Florida, he wasn't winning the Latino vote in states, but he was doing better enough than your typical Republican that it helped him out in critical swing states.
Thanks. So Patrick, one other question, and then we'll move on to Maria for a bit. But do you see any changes in voting patterns between cities and suburbs? And so the idea, the question is are the movements both either out to the suburbs or back to the cities, and how is that affecting overall vote totals or overall votes, and perhaps in particular, how are suburban Latinos versus urban Latinos? Is there seeing differences there?
Yeah, that's a good question, because we'll have to see how that kind of plays out, especially with COVID and people potentially moving out of the cities. But I would assume that Latinos would behave politically like white Americans in this regard. As they move from urban areas to the suburbs, they are more likely to be Republican, but they're also bringing their democratic tendencies with them, at least in the intermediate run.
Okay. Great. Okay. All right. So I think we'll come back to you a little bit later. I wanted to move on to Maria and get your take on a couple things. You're with us there, Maria? I think you froze for a little bit.
Yeah.
But I think you're back with us.
Yes, I am.
Okay. So, as working for the Department of Health, I know, that we have that we've never had a pandemic and an election like this, and so I'm just sort of wondering, from your sort of public health perspective, how you think COVID-19 is going to influence the voting process, and how it might particularly influence Latinos in the voting process.
Right, that's a great question, and thank you again for having me. So I just want to, before I answer that question, I just want to say that I am speaking today as the Latino coordinator for the State Democratic Committee. Happy to answer any questions relating to health and how the pandemic affects the voting process, especially this year. But essentially, there's a lot of mistrust in our government, and the state of New Jersey has done tremendous work with making sure that we have a vote by mail process this election. So that's a step ahead. We've also done voter registrations online, so that's another plus for the state of New Jersey, and I'm sure that other states are doing the same thing. But there's still a lot of mistrust within our government, right? We always hear the rhetoric of your vote may not count, and we just have to stay away from that rhetoric. Especially as a Latina and Latinos, we have to ensure that, especially this year, we make sure that we exercise our right to vote. So there's definitely going to be some hurdles that a lot of our community has to jump. For instance, not everyone is familiar with the vote by mail process, right? I myself have found myself, guiding family members, friends through the process, right? And right now we're getting a lot of the vote by mail ballots, and I have people texting me like, I need your help with this, and happy to do that. So I think now more than ever, we need to ensure that we work together, and we have someone that is familiar with the process, that we help each other out, but just to make sure that our friends and family get out there and vote. But that's one of the hurdles that we're going to encounter is a lot of people are getting nervous about, is my vote by mail ballot going to make it there on time? So one thing that I do encourage people to do is, like, as soon as you get your ballot, make sure that you complete it and send it out immediately. So the earlier the better. And also, if you feel more comfortable dropping your ballot to the Board of Elections, then do that. If you're able to do that, I encourage you to do that, because it's a critical election. To your point, Dr. Hale and Dr. Fisher, this is a critical election, and as we become the majority and the fastest growing minority group in the U.S., we need to ensure that this year we come out and vote. We are a voting bloc, and I think that even though we're huge in numbers, sometimes candidates could leave us behind or could forget about us. But we are, theoretically, in numbers, we are strong and powerful. So I just want to ensure that even though we're dealing with a pandemic, the states are reopening, I think that we need to ensure that our friends and families get out there and vote.
Okay. So I do, maybe this is a little bit off topic, but I'm hoping you can put your public health hat on a little bit, and what have you seen in terms of how COVID-19 is affecting communities of color around the state of New Jersey? And can you just give us sort of a background, because I think that's an important context for what we might expect in terms of turnout. I mean, if there are differences between different groups in their incidence of COVID-19, if you're worried about, your abuela who has COVID-19, who cares about voting? It's like, you can, at least that's a theory. So I just wanted to know if you had any thoughts on that issue.
You make a great point. So unfortunately, the two groups that have been hit the hardest in the state of New Jersey are Latinos and African Americans. A lot of our families and friends and people that we know have pre-existing conditions. And that's when one of the issues with our communities, right? So we're more prone to getting COVID-19. So and also like our living conditions, right? I myself grew up in Plainfield, so it's a lot of multi-generational homes, a lot of families living in one home. So it's definitely has hit our Latino community the hardest, and we've seen that in New Jersey, in New York, in Connecticut. But definitely, I think that COVID-19 will impact the election and the turnout, because people, like you said, people are worried about job security. Am I going to have a job in the next couple of months? There's different issues that people are looking at, or housing, right? Am I going to be moved out? Like, am I going to leave the state? Or there's a lot of issues that healthcare is another one, right? We don't know. There's a lot of questions out there that I think that our families are more worried than coming out during the election day to vote, or sending your ballot through the mail. So there's a lot of issues that are definitely affecting our communities that are not right now in our minds. In the Latino community, I don't think the number one priority at this point is voting. I hope it is that, but I know that there's other issues that are around that. So,
that's a great segue. We have Jonathan Castaneda, who is on the telephone, and so Jonathan, welcome. It's good to have you. It's good to have you again. So I got a question for you. So from a local perspective, I mean, you're right there on the ground in West New York, and has a large Latino population. You're involved in grassroots politics, and as a municipal administrator, you're the closest government to many folks. So I'm wondering what you're hearing in terms of what are the issues that the community is interested in. What are they talking about? What are they focused on? Maria mentioned, housing, jobs, healthcare, and things like that. But I'm wondering if you're hearing similar things.
Sure. Thank you, Dr. Hill and Anna, for putting this together, and for the members of this panel, and for the people who joined us tonight. I think this discussion, as the former panelists have mentioned, Dr. Fisher, Anna, or rather Maria, sorry, oh, the screen just changed. That threw me off. I'm sorry. Yeah, all those issues are important. All those issues are important. Of course, on the ground, coming off the heels of, as Maria said, COVID, not off the heels. I think it's, we're still rather in it, but, the biggest priorities are always going to be rental assistance, keeping, our small business owners continuing to try to plow on and survive as best they could. Access to healthcare is a major issue, but I think especially on the heel of last night's debate, the ever important topic that perhaps doesn't come up as much, but it's obvious that there's a stark difference between the two candidates at the top. But most people realize that that this election is about a lot more than just the people at the top of the tickets. Health is on the line, as you mentioned. Education is on the line. Civil rights are on the line. And not to be dramatic, because I don't like to be dramatic, but and I think, Dr. Hill, you alluded to this in the beginning of your statement. Democracy's on the line. The President of the United States repeated last night that if he were to lose, that he would not recognize the results. I mean, what? So I think, little tidbits like that resonate with individuals on the ground, and as I like to call it, Radio Vemba, right? Word of mouth. That's what people are talking about. They highlight the differences between the two candidates, but I think at the same time, there's certain transgressions that people aren't willing to accept. Now, my dad, for instance, emigrated here from Cuba, and who would have who also wouldn't have accepted results if they didn't come in his favor? Fidel and Raul Castro. So, it's little things that if people were to sit down and realize, okay, well, what he's saying isn't really matching with the rhetoric that's coming out of his party, that I think our nation perhaps would see a little clearer.
So thanks, John. I think it's a great perspective. I also wanted to sort of touch base with you again on looking at some of the health disparities that Marie was talking about, and from your perspective, seeing those, are you seeing those on the ground? Are you seeing that the community is in need in a way that maybe they haven't been before? And if you could just speak to sort of how you're dealing with it as an official, and how it's happening at the local level in terms of COVID, and then maybe if you could also sort of expand on that, of how you think that the counties are going to be dealing with the voting processes in terms of vote by mail.
Okay, well, those are very good questions. I think to answer the first question, certain, and I guess as it ties into the election, our communities have expected a lot from our elected leaders over the course of the last X amount of years. I mean, you go back 20 years, right? And election after election after election, certain promises of economic development, community development, the proper investments in healthcare, access to quality jobs, right, have been perhaps pushed to the side, not always as a circumstance of the individuals who are in power, also as a circumstance of the time. A recent report by what I still know as the National Council of La Raza Unidos US is what their new name is, published a report that mentions the fact that job opportunities have been consistently on top of the priorities for Latinos across the nation. And we as a community, according to this article, I share the same sentiment, have not benefited from the hard work. As a result of the coronavirus, we're in an even worse spot than we were before. Certain financial, let me rephrase, certain families, many families who were saving up for households, albeit not having access to the best paying jobs, took a massive hit, which they will probably never be able to recover from, right? Families, small business owners, entrepreneurs, which, our communities of color, Latinos specifically, compose not even 10%. And I don't know about the figure in the state. Nationally, it's about 10%. So we're already behind, right? There's not an equal. Oh, and then that's without even tallying or adding the issue of education, which, as a result of COVID, certain hurdles, our community, which will undoubtedly impact our community a lot more than many other communities. I mean, our Latinos have lower access to technology, available technology, on-hand technology, lower rates of access to broadband, right? So there's many issues on the ground that we're having to face with as a result of COVID. With that being said, as it applies to this election, I think the county clerk, at least in the county of Hudson, where I'm from, Junior Maldonado, has done an excellent job informing, of publishing, of keeping people abreast. I mean, he just, and I haven't published because I didn't get a chance, but I actually voted right before this. I took a picture. He did a little challenge where you post your picture, of you voting, and I think that's perhaps the most key and important aspect of this election, right? Our biggest resource is not the elected officials. It's not local leadership as far as political parties. It's ourselves, right? because it's easy to just go online and post about your gripe, but it's not easy. It's simpler just to vote. I'm not saying you shouldn't post on social media. What I'm saying is you should wait until you vote, to post about your gripe, because to an extent, that's what should give us permission to post about our gripes. I mean, I'm not saying that we should all be forced to vote, but the effects of this election, as you put it, Dr. Hill, they're decisive for our community, and I think as a community, Latinos, Hispanics, Latinx, however you want to categorize us, the implications of our role, right, in this American society will be defined by the collective performance of our community this election, and it's going to be, I mean, every election is exciting, but yes, I'm very excited about this election for that reason.
Excellent. Okay. Okay, so I think we've reached a time where we might have some questions from members of the audience, and Anna, can you pick people out, or should I pick people out if they have questions, or what's the plan? If you have a question, you can raise your hand. You can put it in the chat box. Don't be shy. There's no grades, so it's cool. But if you have any questions for any of the panelists, we've got some time.
Yes, so if anyone has some questions, please use the raise hand function. In the interim, we do have a question that was pinged. If we can talk a little bit about the fact that Latinos are now one of the biggest voting blocs, yet historically we've had under 50% representation in the polls, so more than 50% of Latinos don't come out to vote. Like, how is that going to be even further stressed by COVID-19, and what are politicians doing at a state level and at a local level to mobilize the Latino population?
Can I step in there? I can't really address the COVID as a political scientist because I have no idea how the COVID, but I can address it in terms of the debate last night. And whatever else, and this is kind of tying together a few different points that were made by others, Maria in particular, with mail-in voting. Whatever else you want to say about last night's debate doesn't exist in a healthy democracy. It was just a debacle. And to me, really emphasize just how important we really are voting if we want to continue American democracy. I think that's the way I felt. And that leads us to the mail-in voting. Trump is trying to discourage that because he's trying to discourage turnout. Okay, so I don't know how COVID will play out, but the president is obviously trying to discourage turnouts, and that's going to disproportionately affect Latinos in that regard. Trump is not adopting a strategy to mobilize Latinos, quite the opposite.
And I'll just add that's actually a fundamental change for the Republican Party. Pre-Trump, the Republican Party was actively courting Latino voters. Latino voters and Latinos, particularly, there was a thought that the Republican Party might be able to attract Latino voters around the issue of choice because of the high rates of Catholicism, and Trump literally threw that playbook away, and that any attempt by Trump or the Republicans to reach out to Latinos disappeared when he came to power. So that is a big change. So.
Yeah, and George W. Bush, it was a group he courted in both 2000 and 2004, and the Republicans really sold that as a good long-term strategy. But it's just many things that Trump has discarded from kind of Republican conventional wisdom, I think.
Yep. So Jonathan and Maria, perhaps is your role with the Democrats, and what are some of the things that the parties are doing to encourage turnout and to get as much turnout as they as they possibly can. It's different. It's a different process this time. There used to be a lot more knocking on doors, and so what's replacing that, and how are you doing that outreach?
Absolutely. So the we're only 34 days away from election day, and I think the pandemic is not only going to affect the election turnout, but also census turnout. I believe New Jersey is about 68% of their completion rate, 68%. So at a national level, I think it's like 66%. So we're doing a little better than the national rate, but we need to get to the 99.9%. And today is the last day for to complete your census. But with that, the pandemic is going to be affecting both turnouts. With the Latino Caucus, and specifically with the State Democratic Committee, we've been working with the Biden campaign. Recently, we are going to have, on October 6th, we're going to have phone banking. So it's going to be virtual. We're doing a lot of events virtual. We're allocating an hour. So we're calling it Power Hour, but it's going to be a bilingual phone banking. So, we invite our members to come out and join us online wherever they are to just allocate 1 hour for phone banking. So it's bilingual. We're also doing some webinars and teaching people how to complete the vote by mail ballot in both English and Spanish. And also we're communicating with some of the county clerks to ensure that they are offering information in both languages. And I think that's what we're doing most recently. We're engaging a lot with the Biden campaign. We're doing a lot of virtual events. I know that they're engaged with a lot of public figures like The Rock and some famous people. So they're doing a lot of engagement throughout the state and throughout the country. But it's a different atmosphere, right? We are used to knocking on doors, or like the Sunday before election day, we'll actually go to the churches and do a lit drop. So it's definitely has changed what that looks like this year.
Anything you want to add, Jonathan? I do see a hand up. If you want to move on, or you want to add something as well.
We have a hand up, and then we have 2 questions, one specifically for Jonathan.
Well, I just want to say something before we move on. The current, it's definitely a difficult election. I mean, the only other election we could compare it to is the June primary, which was a complete it's like you don't even, every campaign tactic just goes out the window, right? And I think at least in Hudson County, Democratic powerhouses, municipalities compete among each other for higher turnout. And I think this election, local county chairs, definitely in West York, you could bet that election, we've been getting out the vote starting today when the ballots arrived, right? So, and we take a different approach as well. We try to I guess allow people to be the leaders of their own mini campaign, and we found that to be effective, right? So our we literally call everybody to action. Call 20 people right now, and make them call 20 people FaceTime, right? So we try to get our people to explain what the impact of this election are, and I think that's really worked for us here in West York. So,
okay. Yeah. All right, Anna, do you want to go ahead for the next question, or to call on the hands?
Yes. So we have 2 questions from the chat box. One is, do you believe in the integrity of vote in mail? The second is directly for you, Jonathan. In West New York, in your community, is there a sense of voter apathy across the board, or a sense of loss given the current political climate? And then after that, then we can go on to, there are 2 hands up.
Just want to point to the panelists that we probably have about 15 or 20 minutes left. So if we want to get to as many questions as we possibly can. So who wants to take the integrity of the vote by mail? What do we think about that?
I'll start off, because I'm originally from Washington State, from Seattle, and Washington State has been 100% vote by mail for quite a while. Oregon has been 100% vote by mail since the 1990s. So it's been tried at the statewide level and it works. I think this election cycle, there are states that are just kind of late getting the ball running. And some states, I think, are better prepared for the vote count of mail-in votes than others. But depending on what state you live, Washington State, Oregon, Utah, a completely different political state, is also 100% mail-in voting. But if you're in a state where historically there's not a large mail-in voting percentage, I would suggest it's legitimate. There's integrity there, but you want to mail it sooner rather than later. I think that's going to be the issue, is for those ballots coming in after Election Day, those might not be counted in states where it's not a clear law. Washington State, they definitely are counted as long as it's postmarked by Election Day. Oregon, Utah, these states, it's institutionalized like that, but other states don't necessarily have that.
In New Jersey, if it was, as long as it's postmarked, it'll be counted. The tough part is that postmarked does not mean you get to drop it off on Election Day at the post office. If you're going to go to the post office, it needs to be far before Election Day. So, Jonathan, the other question was to you. So, do you want to tackle that one about the?
Yeah, sure. So presidential elections usually drive up turnout across the state, across the country, really. In 2016, our turnout in West York was about 63%, which is well above, right, what a normal general election would yield, which at best is 17% turnout. I don't believe that voter apathy is an issue this election. I think people feel a lot. And unlike past elections where one has to reach our people to make sure they vote, I can't tell you how many people have called myself, the mayor, the local governing body, to pretty much beg for their ballots, right? Again, they didn't arrive till today. People are aware that mailing started last week. They haven't received it, so they're calling to beg for their ballots because they want to partake in the process. And I think that's indicative of the fact that I don't think voter apathy will be an issue this election.
Okay.
Perfect. Thank you, Jonathan. So we can go on to some hands that we have raised. So we'll start with Nicholas.
Hi, Dr. Fisher. Hi, Dr. Rail. Good to see you again. I have a question. Does the presence of a Latino on the ballot affect Latino turnout for an election?
Yes, it does. There's not a whole lot of evidence at the statewide level, but at the local level, there is, and that's consistent also with African Americans as well.
Absolutely. Okay.
And then we have, thank you, Nicholas. And then we have Christina.
Hello, everyone. I guess I wanted to go back to, I guess, Mark Fisher's comment when we talked about Puerto Ricans who are American citizens, but keeping in mind that there are American citizens that if living on the island cannot vote. So the issues for Puerto Ricans are very much different from the issues of, I guess, the rest of the Latino population in the United States, right? And so what I'm seeing personally, I live on the island, and I'm seeing there's more of an issue with Biden because he was on the same administration, the Obama administration, that implemented La Junta Promesa, which is an oversight board for Puerto Rico's finances. And Puerto Ricans were very much not happy about this, and for that reason are pushing the diaspora in the United States to vote green, whatever that looks like. So I guess my question was more so for Jonathan Castaneda, hello, one of my old classmates. When you said earlier about people posting their gripe, what do you say to Puerto Ricans that live, that are supposedly American citizens, 3.5 million American citizens that cannot vote, and can't necessarily vote and then post their gripe. They're not allowed to do so in the first place.
I mean, that's a fair aspect, and that is yes. Look, I have, so when I lived in Washington, most of my friends were Puerto Rican. I have a fairly okay grasp of the issues pertaining to the Puerto Rican diaspora, and I think it's a fair point to say what you just mentioned, right? What do you say? My comment was not, I guess it didn't take into account Puerto Ricans per se, and I apologize for that. I sure hope that Puerto Ricans soon have the right to vote in presidential elections. I think it's about right.
I mean, well, a lot of Puerto Ricans don't feel that way. A lot of Puerto Ricans want independence. So that's the other issue with Democrats, is that they're pushing statehood. So
I hope that Puerto Ricans have whatever decision they eventually get to after whichever election they decide to move forward with, that'll decide that. I think, how many elections have we had so far to decide a path? I mean, I think we're up to like 5 last time I checked, 5 or 6. So it's a tough question. I mean, look, voting one way or another, voting green, voting, the most important thing is just to vote, right? Vote how you feel. If you feel like voting for the Green Party is what you feel, I mean, vote for the Green Party. Is it the best politics? No, right? As a party, we have to stay as close together as possible, because fragmentation leads to what happened in 2016 in places like Michigan, right? So my big thing is just to vote. Just vote. As long as our voices, as our ballots are in, I think the impact of that is more important than having the right candidate, right? But just make sure you vote. That's
I think Christina's point is a really interesting one, in that the complexity of understanding the Latino vote, the diversity within particular parts of the Latino vote. The idea of, some people want want independence, some people want citizenship, some people want to become a state, and some of those folks are, as I mentioned earlier, have moved to Florida, right? And so how that's going to play out, are the 400,000 Puerto Ricans who moved to Florida post the hurricane, how are they going to vote? That's a question we don't know the answer to, and that's one of the sort of wonderful things about studying political science and trying to figure out the question of what are the patterns that we might fall in and might fall into, and maybe those patterns aren't going to happen. I like Jonathan's point of, no matter what, vote. And no matter, and think that through. But I do think it is interesting to think through those ideas as we're trying to predict stuff. So.
To your point, Dr. Hell, earlier, I think that one of the things that you started all the conversation is, yes, there's a lot of issues that are affecting the Latino community, but we shouldn't be stuck to like just one issue, right? We should look at the big picture. We have the Puerto Ricans that, have their own issues, and we have Central Americans and South Americans that might care about immigration reform. But at the end of the day, one single issue should not dictate how you're going to vote for a particular party. I think you should ask yourself, what do I want for the next 4 years? What do I want this country to look like, and what's going to be the best outcome for my community, for people that look like you and I. So I think that's something that we need to consider, is like looking at the broader picture and not just focus on just one single issue.
I'm glad you brought that up, and the three of you kind of hit it on the importance of voting. And just to plug in Seton Hall University's partnership with TurboVote for students on the call, TurboVote is a platform that will help Seton Hall University students register to vote. So make sure you register and exercise your right to vote. Maria, we actually have a question for you. You spoke about the census earlier, and the question is, I'm sorry, I just lost it. So the question is, has COVID-19 and the rhetoric of the administration jeopardized how New Jersey citizens and minorities complete their census?
So I think I alluded to this earlier, that New Jersey, for instance, we have 68%, 68%, national is 66%. So we're a little higher than the national rate. But I think that it definitely, the political climate definitely impacted the outcomes, right? We have a president that has an agenda, an anti-immigration agenda. And a lot of people are fearful, especially the Latino community, where we have mixed families. We have those that are born in the U.S., those that became U.S. citizens in the process, and then you have the undocumented. So I think that there is some fear in our communities given the political climate that definitely affected our numbers. People don't want to disclose their personal information or their families or how many people live in a household. They want to make sure that they still are under the shadows. And one thing that I have to, I always told my family and friends is that despite your immigration status, there are laws in place that protects, ICE to look in, or any other agency to look into the information that is recorded in the U.S. Census. So up to this day, I was texting some friends, reminding them that today's the last day, because this defines how much money the state of New Jersey and other states get from the federal government. And this is something that impacts our community, right? Lunches, like lunch programs, healthcare, is everything is dependent on the census. So it's very critical that we complete it.
Maria, I just want to make sure that I thought that there had been a stay by a judge that we were going to be able to count census votes for about another month, but is that not the case?
They extended it to October. As of now, it's October 5th. Numerators are going out until October 5th.
Okay.
Maybe I missed it, but thank you for pointing that out. So we have more time.
But they might extend it to October 31st. I mean, it all depends.
Okay, great.
So if you haven't done it, do it.
Right.
You got an extra 5 days, so get out and get the census done.
We have a question from Angelina.
Yes, good evening. So regarding the vote by mail option, Dr. Hale, we were just speaking about this in a case study, the election fraud. So it's not only geared towards the municipal administrator, but Ms. Sikosa, I don't want to mispronounce her name. How are you addressing, or how you think local officials are addressing election fraud? Because in the primaries, there was a case on election fraud in municipality of Passaic County.
So I think Angelina's talking about the ballots that were not counted in the primaries in Patterson. I don't know that I'd characterize that quite as election fraud. I'd characterize it as an election mistake. I don't know, Jonathan, if you know a little bit more about that situation.
Well, that was certainly election fraud. Planned, organized election fraud, done in part by individuals who needed to resort to those tactics to win. And it's unfortunate, and it does discredit this process that we're depending on during this period. But it's what we have. Does it lend itself to fraud in certain cases? Perhaps, but we who hold ourselves to a higher standard and a higher moral guide and believe in the beauty of elections, we have to do everything in our power to make sure that it's done right by the people. And in that case, sure, yes, it's actually quite disgusting, what they did. And things like that have happened across the state. Hoboken had an issue a couple years ago. And it's power lends itself, or the pursuit of power lends itself to individuals trying to do everything they can to seek it. So to answer your question, yes. So to the extent that vote by mails lend themselves to fraud, perhaps. But that's why you as an individual should make sure that your individual families vote. Make sure they get to vote today and fill it out, and don't seek unsolicited people coming to their homes and And I mean, most of this stuff happens in senior buildings, right? You know, low income housing, where people, you know, try to harvest, I guess, votes, and it's not right. So,
I just wanted to point out, and then I think, Anna, are we about ready to wrap it up? I think so. We'll let our panelists have a last couple words as well. Couple things that I think are important. If you are not registered to vote and you live in New Jersey, October 13th is your last day to register, and you can register online. So you still have some time to actually register to vote. If you are registered to vote, but you did not get a vote by mail sent to you, perhaps, and that happens a lot with students, it may be sent to your home or something. You should try and track down your vote by mail ballot that was sent to you if you've been an active voter. But if you are unable to do that, you can also still request a new vote by mail ballot up through October 23rd. So those are important deadlines, I think, for people to recognize. If you are not registered in New Jersey, you have until October 13th. If you would like a vote by mail ballot sent to your home, if you do not have one, you have until October 23rd. And then in terms of actual voting, you can, after you fill out your vote by mail application, you can send it through the Postal Service. Again, we've heard again and again about doing it as early and as early as you possibly can. That's the most important thing. There will be drop boxes that are all over the state. And so you can put them in drop boxes that will not go through the mail. You can walk into county clerks and you can hand them your ballot and they will give that. You can also go to a polling place on election day. You will be given a paper ballot on election day, which they will cross-check and vote after and count after they have made sure you have not voted by mail, which makes sense. We don't want people to vote twice. But you can actually go to a polling place and take a provisional ballot that will be counted once they are ensuring that you have not been already voted by vote by mail. If there is any place that you are if you have any questions about voting, any questions about the process of voting, if you go to any search engine and type in 2020 New Jersey voter portal, it'll pop up, and it's the State Division of Elections, and there's information, and all of the ones that I just gave you is available there. You can find out whether you're registered, you can find out where you're registered, you can find out how to register, you can find out how to get a vote by mail application. It's a great source. So I would encourage that. So
we have a clarification point from the audience. If in the state of New Jersey, ballots are going to be sent without having to request them.
Correct. If you are, but if you haven't got one, if you are an active voter, you will get one. But there is a distinct possibility that you will not, that some people won't get them. And what I was saying is that even if they have mailed it out, if you have requested, you can still request one up through the 23rd. So we're expecting 5.7 million people in New Jersey to get ballots mailed to them directly. So absolutely, good point.
Perfect. So I think we hit on so many important topics. You know, fill out your census, register to vote. Final thoughts from the I almost said candidates, from the panelists. The final thoughts from the panelists can actually revolve around a question that we got from one of the students. The question says, I noticed that numerous people do not want to vote because they do not like either candidate. What can we say to encourage people to still vote?
I would ask them why. Why don't they identify with a candidate, whatever it is, whether it's the left or right? Just ask them why, and just, you know, encourage them to not only vote, maybe they want to also do some research on their own about what it means to be, or to identify with, you know, one of the parties, and just, I think that would kind of give them some sense of some direction of where they will land. And overall, like, you know, I agree with Dr. Hell. Make sure that you vote, but also engage with whatever party you identify with, whether you're Democrat or Republican, like make sure you do some advocacy work, make sure you get out and do some phone calls. We're not doing a lot of door knocking, but definitely a lot happening virtually. So just get engaged. I think that will give you some sense of the issues that your candidate stands for. So just get involved.
I would just also point out that there are more people than Donald Trump and Joe Biden on the ballot. There are congressional races, there are local races, and at the end of the day, if you are not enamored by either of the presidential candidates, that doesn't mean that you can't fall in love with one of the down ballot candidates. And so that might be an entryway for people to recognize that those people matter. The work that Jonathan does on a daily basis, and the work that Maria does, they're not elected officials, but that's state and local government, and that's important. And to get involved at that level is a great entryway into politics, even if we're a little bit sad about the folks at the top of the ticket.
Dr. Fisher, Jonathan, do you guys want to deliver your final thoughts?
I mentioned earlier that this election would be decisive to our community, and I just want to reiterate that, right? To the point of, if you don't know who to vote for, I mean, as a community, whether the only thing we could perhaps all agree on is that this president has been toxic to our community. I mean, if you don't know Trump's stance, how he feels about us, I just don't know. I just don't know where you've been. This is an individual whose toxic politics has just divided us. It's destroyed our fabric as a nation. And I think if I could stand 4 more years of this toxicity, right? This just.
Jonathan, I think we lost you.
Can you hear me?
Now we can.
Now we can.
What did you hear last? I can't take 4 years of this.
Can't take 4 years of this.
The toxicity of this president.
Yeah, the toxicity. I can't do another 4 years of this. And so to the larger point, as a community, we have to vote. Whether you vote for Biden or Trump, I guess it's up to you. If you can't see where we should fall on that spectrum, I think I just don't know. But our collective performance, as I discussed earlier, is what's important here in the long term, right? Because our community has to get respected. We have to be involved and considered. And I think a big consequence of not voting is that we're just not considered. Our community is just not considered or taken into account. So that's it. Yeah.
And just to add on, in terms of people that are indecisive, which is it's a much smaller group than it usually is. My gut instinct was just, vote on the basis of policy. What policies do you care about, and pick the candidate that agrees with your policies. But after listening to Jonathan, it's like, as a political scientist, it's like, actually, it all comes back to who the incumbent is. For the presidential, for other offices, it's obviously different. But does Donald Trump deserve 4 more years? It's a referendum on the incumbent president, and every election where a president is coming up for re-election is ultimately a referendum on that president. And I think that's definitely a legitimate way of looking at it, in a relatively easy way.
Thank you, everybody, for your final thoughts. Again, as a reminder to the Seton Hall students on this call, you can use TurboVote to register to vote if you can. The link is in the chat box. We also dropped in the website that Dr. Hale mentioned that walks you through how to register to vote in New Jersey and walks you through the mail-in ballot process. So if there are any other links or things that we can send out to the students, please let us know. Thank you so much for attending tonight. Remember to fill out your census and remember to exercise your right to vote. Thank you so much to the panelists, to our alumni, Maria and Jonathan. You guys were wonderful. And Dr. Hale and Dr. Fisher, thank you so much for your insightful comments.
Thank you.
Thank you guys so much. Have a good night. Thank you.
Good night.
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 Thank you.